Oswetha chi gyd. Can I check, is this mic activated, Andy? It is now, is it? Can I check that you can all hear me comfortably at the back there? You can? Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. Well, welcome to you all on the rather fifth evening to a special event. Hosted here at the university by two of its research centres, RIA and CREW. And I'd like to thank Helen Baldwin for her part in the organisation of the event. But primarily, it's been organised and generously sponsored by the Learned Society of Wales, of which all three of us happen to be fellows. And I'm enormously grateful to the staff there, Lynn Williams, Georgia, and finally, most importantly, Sarah Morse, who has done prodigious work in order to bring everything together. Well, this year we celebrate, as most of you now know, the centenary of R.S. Thomas's birth. He was therefore born, hard maybe to believe, a year before his namesake, Dylan Thomas. And in the first half of the 20th century, you might say that Dylan was king, where the second half, I suppose, has belonged to R.S. Thomas here in Wales. And by today, the poetry of both Thomases has been translated into a dozen or so of the world's languages. R.S. Thomas spent his working life as a priest in the church in Wales, and by the end of his life in 2000, he'd also been publishing poetry for the best part of 60 years. And he remains popular. You go to any bookshop where poetry is still stocked, and you'll find that his poetry is still readily available. His output can very crudely be divided into two phases. The first phase, running roughly from 1945 to 70, his concentration was on the enigmatic upland farmer of his devising, Iago Prydderch. And in the second, from 1970 to his death in 2000, it was an incorrigibly enigmatic divinity that received his obsessive attention. And with me this evening to celebrate R.S.'s work as a religious poet, two of the most eminent churchmen of our day. Rowan Williams, of course, here on my left. If you Google Rowan Williams, you are warned, Rowan Williams, not to be confused with Rowan Anthony Williams, a well-known English boxer. Well, this Rowan Williams has recently honoured his native locality by accepting the title of Baron Williams of Oystermouth. And he is, of course, one of the most brilliant theologians of our time and a gifted poet. Sometime Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Oxford, he became Archbishop of Wales before accepting demotion to Archbishop of Canterbury. He's at present Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. Barry Morgan, a native of Gwauncaig, has spent his life in the service of the church in Wales and has, I'm glad to say, resisted promotion to the See of Canterbury to remain Archbishop of Wales. Both have written very fine studies of R.S.'s spiritual poetry, with Barry Morgan shrewdly characterising it as manifesting a strange orthodoxy. You can say that again. And both of them have, at my prompting, selected a few poems which they may or may not want to discuss, but hopefully you've all got Xeroxed copies anyway available to you. So if they do decide to refer to those poems, you too have the means, hopefully, of looking at them at the same time yourselves. Can I confirm that's the case? Yeah? You've all got Xeroxes? Thank you. Well, let's start by listening to R.S. himself in his prime. In 1972, a remarkable film profile was made of him by the internationally renowned filmmaker, a native of Dunvant, Swansea, John Ormond. And during the course of that film, R.S. had something quite controversial to say about religion and about poetry. So, Andy, if we can possibly roll that, thank you very much.
people seem to be worried that how do I combine my work as a poet and work as a priest? This is something that never worries me at all. It doesn't seem to worry people whether they've been influenced by Jeremiah Hopkins' difficulties, or whether they've got thoughts of Kierkegaard or something like that, who gave up poetry in his quest for God. And I don't know, but to me, any form of orthodoxy is just not part of a poet's province at all. A poet must be able to claim a certain amount of poetic license, of freedom to follow the vision of poetry, the imaginative vision of poetry. And after all, what is today's orthodoxy is only tomorrow's antiquity, if it comes to that. There's really no need to bother much about that at all. And in any case, poetry is religion, religion is poetry. The message of the New Testament is poetry. Christ was a poet. The New Testament is metaphor. The resurrection is metaphor. And I feel perfectly within my rights and in approaching my whole vocation as priest and my function as a preacher in presenting poetry. When I preach poetry, I am preaching Christianity, and when one discusses Christianity, one is discussing poetry in its imaginative aspects, the core of both our imagination, as far as I'm concerned. And, so that I'm not personally worried about this at all. And,
you're saying that the notion of Christ's resurrection is a metaphor?
I consider that resurrection is a metaphorical use of language, as is the incarnation. We are not so hag-ridden today by heresy hunters as they were in the early centuries of the church, and there's no doubt that we commit a lot more important heresies probably than in saying that resurrection and incarnation are metaphors. My work as a poet has to deal with the presentation of imaginative truth. Christianity seems to me also a presentation of imaginative truth, so that there is no conflict, there's no necessary conflict between these two things at all. And as a priest, I am committed to the ministry of the Word and the ministry of the sacraments. Well, word is metaphor, language is sacrament, sacrament is language. The combination is perfectly simple.
Thank you, Andy. Well, I think you can go home after that, really. That's, it is, I'm sure, it is true to say that R.S. rarely passed up a chance to be controversial, and he certainly was there. But at the same time, I don't know about you two, but I feel he was laying bare a belief and poetry that was seminal in his case as a priest and as a poet. But which of you would like to answer that? I thought it might be, yes, okay.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, yeah.
Yes, I mean, the statements about poetry and religion there are echoed, of course, by quite a lot of other poets. And there's actually a poem by Les Murray, the Australian Catholic poet, which begins exactly like that, saying, poetry is religion. Now, the problem, I think, with this, as it's often heard, is that we slip the word just in somewhere. This is just a metaphor, or this is just imagination. And what I hear R.S. saying there is something a bit more tough than that. When we talk about metaphor, when we talk about poetry, we are actually talking about ways of knowing. And the word truth in the phrase imaginative truth is not redundant. You know, there are claims here being made. And I think perhaps this is my own orthodox prejudice, but I think it would be wrong to read him as saying, well, this is just a way of talking. It's just a way of talking about exciting and rather warmly glowing spiritual things that make me feel better. It's the last thing you say about RS, actually, isn't it? Make you feel better.
Yes, he's not a tonic, is he?
He's not a tonic, no.
Barry, would you go along with that? Is that the way that you see it?
Yeah, and I think that's borne out actually in his poetry, because, as Rowan says, it's not just a metaphor. It's not just poetry. It's not just anything really. When you look at some of his poetry, you can see the deep faith of this man, because he comes back again and again and again to the centrality of the person of Jesus. That for him, God is defined as to be found in Jesus. And a lot of his poetry comes back to an unpenitent cross, that love's risen body. At Christmas, we see how love bleeds.
So you'd understand that reference, which is in the poetry, the untenanted cross, the cross without the body suspended from it. You'd understand that as a sort of acknowledgement of the living presence of Christ, would you?
Well,
is that what you mean?
Well, it can be taken both ways, and I think he was a bit of a tease, really, both in life and in poetry. I mean, you can take it as meaning untenanted cross, well, there's nobody there.
Yeah, precisely.
Or you could take it as meaning, actually, he is risen, and that's why he's not there.
But he doesn't address many poems to Christ, does he?
He doesn't address any poems to Christ, as far as I'm aware. But he talks all the time about Christ. But I mean, if you were to look at some of the other stuff that he's written about being a poet and being a priest, there is a passage in his autobiography where he says, I try to differentiate between being a priest and being a poet, because I'm not being paid in order to question orthodoxy, he says, when I preach. I'd love to be able to get hold of some of his sermons, just to see exactly what he did say. But I'm not sure that you can't actually say, well, when I'm in the pulpit, I'm orthodox, and when I'm writing poetry, well, I can say what I like. Because, of course, the same people may be listening to the same things. Well,
I'll bring Rowan in a minute, but just to relate something that happened to me earlier this year. I happened to be lecturing about RS and the church in Wales in Manavon, in the church there. And I had a mixed audience, of course, and in the front row there were a couple of elderly ladies, which means ladies my age. and they were listening very intently. And they came up at the end, they said, we want to thank you very much for talking with you about RS. I said, why? They said, we are tired, they said, of hearing him being run down all the time, particularly in his relations with his parishioners. I said, well, that is the image given, but have you had experience of the contrary? They said, well, actually, we were his parishioners at Navon, and we were young, we were in our early teens, and we remember him very well. And I said, what do you remember about him? We remember, they said, his sermons. I said, really? I said, why? Because, they said, they were simple. And we could go home and we could tell our mother, when she wasn't able to be present, exactly what RS had said. Because, as they rather touchingly put it, he knew we were simple people. And therefore, he addressed us in the language that he thought we would understand. Now, how do you square that with the sorts of comments he makes there?
Well, he's a mass of contradictions in all kinds of ways.
I know that,
yes. And therefore, you don't try to square it. I mean, people in Aberdaron, some parishioners would say, well, look, he knew the names of the birds in this parish better than he knew some of his parishioners.
Yes.
You talk to some of his parishioners.
You can sympathize, can't you? Don't answer that.
I'm not going to. But you talk to other people, and they would say to you, when the crunch came and people were dying, he was there, and he would spend the whole night with the dying. And if people were in hospital in Manga, and if you know the geography of the Llŷn Peninsula, Aberdaron is 65 miles from Manga. RS would drive them to visit their sick relatives and would wait for them to come back. So, This man who would poo-poo that kind of thing and who wouldn't admit that he would do that. Other people tell you, he would never tell you.
Okay, well, you can't square the two according to Barry. Is that your feeling, though?
I want to go back to the untenanted cross for a moment, because I do think there is a dimension of poetic writing utterance which has got to be indeterminate, which has got to be open-ended. You can't prescribe how it's going to be read. And I think that means that you're bound to find contradiction in the sense that you might want him to tie it up for you, and he won't, because poets don't.
So, yes.
And
But preachers do.
Preachers do.
Sometimes.
And I think the best preachers do the least of it. That is, they approach most towards poetry, because I think the point of preaching is actually to open people's horizons in a new way, to open places in the heart that they didn't know were there. And that is very close to poetry. But I think what I'm saying is that you would expect a certain tension. He knows what, as a priest, he has to say and do. And there's a stoical sense of duty about it. He's not out to be liked. He's not out to be cuddly. He's not out to be popular. He's out to do the job, which means, driving 65 miles, and so forth.
Absolutely.
And that's what you do. But he's also the man, the person, who will leave you with that untenanted cross and say, well, now you sort this one. You sort this one out. Because that's poetry, I think.
You've just reminded me of a conversation I once had with Peter Walker, Bishop of Ely, who's the man who ordained you,
Indeed.
and who was principal of my theological college. And R.S. Thomas had been invited to Great St. Mary's in Cambridge to read his poetry and to be questioned by the then Vicar Michael Main, who later became the Dean of Westminster. And then they had supper at the vicarage afterwards. And Peter Walker was a very erudite man and loved poetry, the poetry of Geoffrey Hill especially, but he was into R.S. Thomas as well. And there was a particular poem that he was interested in and was dying to find out the meaning of this poem. So he said to R.S., well, can you tell me the meaning of this poem? And R.S. said, the poem is the poem. Well, yes, said Peter, but it can be taken this way and that way. Which is it? The poem is the poem, says R.S. Thomas. Well, is there no explanation then? Said Peter Walker, still persisting as bishops do, And he said, well, certainly not from me. And I think, that's it. And that's the magic of this poetry. Because you're left thinking, well, what does he mean by that then? And it is ambiguous, and there are questions, but isn't life like that? And faith is like that too, really. And faith is, the opposite of faith is not certainty. It's about doubt too. And I mean, the Old Testament and the New Testament are also full of questions. And I think he's in that tradition himself, the prophetic tradition.
And I think that locating him in that tradition is quite important, that there is a long-standing assumption within the world of faith that there is some kind of territory where you can actually let the emotions and the imagination run. You don't have to check it for being safe. So when in the Psalms you find the psalmist saying, "Blessed be he that taketh thy children and dasheth their heads against the stones," the point of that is not this is a godly thing to think. The point is there is space for somebody to express the most murderous rage and get it out there and look at it. Yes. Or similarly in the poetry of St. John of the Cross, arguably the greatest writer about contemplation in the history of Christianity. The poetry is about loss and frustration, brick walls, and then it's about something like an almost erotic fulfillment, and then it's about absence and darkness, and then it's about the blazing sense of presence in the world around, and so on, as if he's saying, I've got to have somewhere to get all this out, because it all has something to do with my basic stance. Or Hopkins and the terrible sonnets. You don't start by saying, am I allowed as a religious person to feel this or to say this? And again, I think that's part of what he was saying in that clip.
Would it be fair to say that he valued poetry primarily because it enabled ambivalence, it promoted it, and the ambivalence that Barry was talking about, that seems to be inherent to all sorts of instincts that Thomas had about the religious life, that it was poetry that was best able to convey that, to allow him the openness of possibility to do that.
I think that's it. Ambivalence is an ambivalent sort of word. It can sound negative. And I wouldn't want it to sound negative. It's not that he's commending a sort of, well, maybe this or maybe that approach. He's saying this is too big for a quick solution. Take your time with this. And if the sense of God that you have is either that he isn't there or that he's some kind of appalling sadist, well, just take it out and look at it. Let it run, as I say. George Herbert does this in his poetry too. He will take you right to the edge of the precipice, as in The Collar. I struck the board and cried no more. As if Herbert is saying, well, stuff this, I've had it with God. I can't make any sense of this at all. And I could be more useful, I could be more glamorous and more sexy and more successful in doing almost anything else than being a priest. An arguable point of view. And then as the car sort of dashes towards the edge of the cliff, there's this sudden kind of grinding of brakes, and he stops short. Now, RS doesn't do it like that, but it's that sense that there's got to be room for this somewhere. I've got to find words that are big enough for this, and that means words that are a bit hollowed out. I'm not going to nail them down. I'm not going to stuff them with my meanings.
And I think too, he's not a systematic theologian. I mean, a systematic theologian would sit down and would, plough his or her way through Christian doctrine, and you'd expect the whole thing to hang together. I mean, he's a poet, so he gets up one morning and he hears something on the radio, perhaps about some awful tragedy in Africa. There's that about the bowed bellies of children.
It's a remarkable one.
And so he writes a poem about that. He gets up perhaps, or he has some kind of experience of the absence of God, and sort of being in church and God seemingly being absent, which is different from there being no God at all. But nevertheless, the whole range of emotions come into it, I think, depending on what he's writing. And I suppose if you try and say, well, let's kind of systematize all this and let's try and make a coherent whole of it, you can't, because that's not what poets do. I mean, I'm not a poet, so I don't know, but I suspect.
I think that is what poets do. And I think the key phrase is the first line of Raptor. You have made God,
by the way,
you have made God small. I don't know if I could just say a word about this, because it's one of...
You might actually read the poem if you don't mind.
I might well, yes. I can feel it coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
But I chose this because it's one that I most often quote if I'm asked to speak about RS. Because I think the extraordinariness of the metaphors here is just haunting. You have made God small, setting him astride a pipette or a retort, studying the bubbles, absorbed in an experiment that will come to nothing. I think of him rather as an enormous owl abroad in the shadows, brushing me sometimes with his wing, so the blood in my veins freezes, able to find his way from one soul to another, because he can see in the dark. I have heard him crooning to himself, so that almost I could believe in angels, those feathered overtones in love's rafters. I have heard him scream, too, fastening his talons in his great adversary, or in some lesser denizen, maybe, like you or me. Now, that works in so many ways, at so many levels, I think. And you begin with this typical kind of negative reaction to the scientific approach, as if, back to what you were saying earlier, as if there were really just one way of knowing clearly. And that was going to be what the pipette or the retort delivers. But then studying the bubbles, and you think of the bubbles in the cloud chamber, some kinds of experiments in physics, then absorbed in an experiment that will come to nothing. And it's exactly nothing that you have to come to. It's, as in St. John of the Cross, it's the nada. It's, you drop all the pictures you started with. But if you're going to have pictures, well, you move on. The enormous owl, the terror of the unconditioned, the transcendent, and this astonishing third stanza, he can see in the dark, finding his way from one cell to another because he can see in the dark, and crooning to himself, which is a deeply eerie image for God, as if when we know God, we don't, as it were, simply face the presence of love or absolution or whatever, but we overhear something spine-tingling, inaccessible, like the owl sort of purring overhead. And then, of course, the wonderful grim smile at the end, fastening his talons in his great adversary. Wonderful if God were simply interested in fastening on the real enemy, which is the devil. But he's also interested in the little enemies, like us.
Yeah.
So,
what's he saying there? What's he saying there?
What's he saying?
Yeah.
The poem is the poem.
And we did not rehearse that.
What's he saying? I don't know. I think part of it is this sense that, yes, when we overhear God, when we are somehow gifted with some sense of the absolute otherness of God, it is terror as much as adoration that's invoked, because the talons are fastened. Now, is that for our rescue or for our consumption?
Yeah.
Well, in this poem, we don't know. And any attempt to get a premature answer to that is making God small again. And the coming to nothing. We have to say, okay, I will live with these 4 stanzas.
He has, as this shows, he does have some very disturbing kind of images for God, doesn't he?
Yes.
As you'll already be aware, there's that wonderful story about Matthew Arnold when he passed to the next world, and one of his colleagues met another of his colleagues, and one said to the other, "Poor old Arnold, he won't like God." And I've always thought that was a perfect description of RS. And I even wondered that maybe that's why he was allowed to live so long, because God didn't really want to meet RS in a hurry.
That's a bit tough on both of them.
But he does have, doesn't he, these extraordinary poems about the divinity.
Yes. And
what are we to make of that?
well, I find it one of the hardest things about the poetry, one of the things I both admire and find difficult, and that is the fascination with cruelty that does run through such a lot of them, and which is projected onto God, but which I think he would say is a reflection of the world we actually inhabit. It's a cruel world. It's a world where owls kill things unpleasantly and noisily, and if it's a world where things kill things, well, what do you say about the creator of such a world? Now, it's another of those cases where I think he's letting it run. And letting it run is a way of looking honestly at the world and not saying, well, all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, as if that kind of solved it. But saying, I am going to look at the world as it actually is. And if this suggests this, well, again, get it out there. But the cruelty, there is something in RS which is, as I say, a bit fascinated by that, and it's a disturbing undertow. I'm not saying that in any condemnatory spirit, just a fact about his imagination. It's a quite violent imagination in some ways.
It is.
But also, too, it's the question that all of us face. We believe in the goodness of God.
Yeah.
We proclaim a God of love. And yet we do live in a universe where there is a great deal of cruelty, where there are natural disasters. And how do you explain all that? And I think, in a sense, he's exploring that question as well. And, you know, to come back to Rowan's poem, The Raptor, I mean, it's no worse than what you have in the book of Job, where Job accuses God of tearing him apart like a lion.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and we tend to forget that bits of scripture are equally graphic in almost, in inverted commas, hatred of God because of what he's doing and what he's up to. You know, and the prophets do that, and certainly the psalmist does that. And of course, Jesus on the cross says, my God, why have you forsaken me now, of course, again? There are different interpretations of that. But that's a haunting kind of cry. And I mean, I think R.S. says, you know, that when he dies, to bellow our defiance at you over the grave's moor. And he refers to Job, and he says that, you know, it's the abused heart, that somehow or other God has abused us, and therefore we've got to tell him how it is and what we feel.
Well, that therefore leads me to a question about what part of the Bible R.S. primarily responds to. I mean, there's certainly been times in the past when I felt like saying, his is an Old Testament God. It's not a New Testament God. And that then would link with my impression that he's not very keen on handling the phenomenon of Christ. When I interviewed him at length, way back in whatever it was, 1995, for a TV program that was never televised, I don't know what's happened to the interview, I told him in advance that I wasn't intending to put him ever on the spot. And so if there were any questions I asked he didn't want to answer, he only had to say, and I would drop them, because I didn't think that was the occasion for it, okay? No problems, until I asked him, what is your view of Christ? Pass, he said.
And yet.
Yes, quite.
And yet, all right.
Because I'm a bit wary of the Old Testament, New Testament God polarity anyway, but that's another story. Okay. I don't see him responding very much, let's say, to St. Paul.
No. No. Not many people do.
I could follow that up, and I think there's one conversation I would quite like to be eavesdropping on. It's R.S. and St. Paul in heaven, but that's another story. He does respond to the Old Testament, but also there is this sense which comes out occasionally. The kingdom is a case in point, isn't it? Because the kingdom which is one of yours, is a fundamentally gospel image.
Absolutely.
And that sense of the complete inversion of the world's values that's represented by the kingdom, and represented therefore by Christ, I think that's a real thing for him. It's not quite as straightforward.
No, I mean, I've just been reading something this week about somebody who's saying, well, you know, we tend to think of the Old Testament as having a fierce, terrible God, and the New Testament as a kind, loving one. And it's not that simple. You've only got to read the book of Hosea to discover this love of God, and the prophets keep on coming back to this loving image of God. But I mean, when you read R.S. Thomas's poem on the kingdom,
which you've got again, haven't you? This is one of the ones you chose. Yeah, that's right. That's towards the end of it.
It's a long way off, but inside it there are quite different things going on. Festivals at which the poor man is king and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love looks at them back. An industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. It's a long way off, but to get there takes no time, and admission is free if you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. And when you read a poem like that, you just think, gosh, you know, this man has got to the heart of the gospel of Jesus, and actually St. Paul too, of the kingdom having drawn near and being with us, and yet also being far off. It's the already and the not yet that New Testament scholars talk about. And St. Paul's idea of God having chosen what is foolish in the eyes of the world and to shame the wise, and he's chosen the weak to shame the strong. And in this, it's reminiscent of the whole ministry of Jesus, really. where he goes out of his way to identify with those who are poor, with those who are sick. Mirrors at which the blind look at themselves and love looks at them back. A kind of double image there of blind people whom he healed, but also too in the New Testament and in St. John's Gospel, blind people are people who willfully will not see the truth. No. And yet, says R.S. Thomas, love looks at them back. And industry, well, we tend to think of industry as a capitalist system and making money and making sure that money is made. But actually, true industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. Yeah. That's an inversion of how we usually think of it. It's a long way off, he repeats that, in other words, we're not there. But to get there takes no time, and admission is free. In other words, this God will embrace you if you will let him. But, and there's always a but, if you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only, and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf, actually, as well as echoes of Jesus, there's echoes of St. Paul there, because St. Paul says, look, you are justified by faith. Your works won't do it. You don't deserve the love of God. It's gratuitously and graciously given to you. So there are echoes of Jesus and Paul, I reckon.
Yes.
To go back to the disconcerting, even the bizarre sorts of poems which narrate encounters with God in his writings, there's that remarkable image that you find in one of them where he speaks of God as a sort of a divine jester, a divine joker.
And Jesus as the incurred stitch
and
in his
Jesus as the incurred stitch, as
yes.
God callously laughs at creation. What on earth are we to make of that?
What indeed, but I think part of that is saying whatever you say about God's attitude to the world in general, as you imagine it, as you fantasize it, he also carries the cost of it. The incurred stitch is the cost to God of the suffering world, which is his own suffering. So when you've said all, again, it's a bit George Herbertish, prolong the metaphor as long as you can. Maybe God is laughing at us, but actually he's got a stitch in his side.
And reminiscent there, of course, of the side of Jesus.
Of course,
being
yes, indeed.
Yes.
So there's always a kind of double meaning. That's right.
Of knowledge. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And the other bit where, where he says, putting your hand into your side, hoping to find it warm, a kind of reference, if you like, to birds, but also to Jesus' invitation to Thomas to put his hand into his side. But I think, to come back to your thing about Jesus, I mean, in spite of what he says about Jesus, he couldn't let him go. I mean, poem after poem, you don't write poems like he kneeled long and saw love in a dark crown of thorns blazing, and a winter tree golden with the fruit of a man's body, or who so beautifully suffered for each of us upon his instrument. So when he's talking there about Chrysler, the violinist, and he says, so it must have been on Calvary, in the fiercer light of the thorn's halo. I mean, again and again, there's this reference to Jesus, and it's always this compassion, this love, and his definition of God. So on the one hand, God is unknowable as he is in himself. He's impassible. He's absent, and yet he draws near in nature, but especially in Jesus.
Yeah, and the climax of another of the great poems here, let me go there.
Yes. That's right.
Yes.
Where the sun set, yes, the sun sets to the Father. Let
mythology, if you
right.
like, but a mythology which is about that insoluble duality of the presence of God, the absence and the presence.
That's right.
Well, if we go to the incarnation for a minute, I would have thought that one quite usual way of viewing it is that God choosing to make himself available to the human. That is, by assuming human flesh. That's one dimension of it. And yet RS seems to stick with an idea of God as being beyond not only the flesh, but the human mind. The God that sometimes is described as the absent God. Again, how do you relate that to what is at the heart of the Christian experience, which is the presence of God as man
All
and
Christians
form?
believe that too, really, because it's both, isn't it? That the God who is beyond us is also the God who comes in Jesus to meet us.
And I think I'd relate it very much to his passionate interest in Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
And for Kierkegaard, what you see in Jesus is not, so to speak, God making himself, again, human and cuddly and immediate. It's the most baffling thing you could imagine, because here is the infinite and unimaginable in the anonymity of a human life.
Yeah.
And that's what Kierkegaard describes in the Philosophical Fragments as reason just running into the buffers. The human mind can't cope with that. So you won't have a presence in your mind in the sense of some nice clear idea about what's going on. You will have encountered something which brings you up short. And in that sense, and I do think Kierkegaard is hugely important for what he's doing in relation to that question.
You have recently come up with a fascinating, tantalizing phrase about RS's sense of divinity. You talk about it as post-ethical. What did you mean by that?
Well, of course, that's a phrase which comes from Kierkegaard, in a sense, Kierkegaard's distinction between the ethical and the religious. If the ethical is all about getting the right answers about how to behave, then RS's God is not going to help you very much, frankly. If what you're interested in is how the truth enlivens, converts, transfigures, judges, okay, then keep reading RS. But post-ethical in the sense that there is no way in which RS's God, I think as he conceives him in the poetry, can be brought into just to back an agenda about human behavior of any kind, which is why you could say RS's religious vision is apolitical as well as post-ethical. It's very much what it is, and woe betide you if you try to make God serve the agenda.
And you see the story of Abraham and Isaac as being crucial there.
Well, that's Kierkegaard's.
In what way?
Yes.
In what way is it relevant there?
Kierkegaard's discussion of the Abraham and Isaac story it's very shocking. Here's the story of God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham says yes, and Kierkegaard says bravo, and you think, pardon? And Kierkegaard goes on to say, the thing is, Abraham is not thinking of anything but the immediacy of God. That's the religious.
Right.
Fear and trembling. You can't say that fits in with anything at all. It's not even, it's not a recommendation to human sacrifice, and it's not a recommendation against human sacrifice. It's that here is a story about somebody who found himself out of all the categories of expectation in the face of God. Now, I won't go into the pros and cons of that as a reading of the story, and a lot of Jewish readers of Kierkegaard have said he doesn't understand anything of what's going on in that story, and that's another discussion. Emil Fackenheim, I think, has a really, really interesting riposte to Kierkegaard from the Jewish point of view. But that's RS's post-ethical again.
Is this what Karl Barth meant, if I'm quoting him rightly, where he says, you can't speak of God by speaking of man in a loud voice?
Yes, yes, precisely.
That God is wholly other to all our categories of understanding.
Yes.
And yet, to come back to your point about the unknowability of God, the darkness of God, the absence of God, and yet made known in Jesus in a country church, where he says...
Again, on these sheets, You can read that, I think, Barry.
Okay, it's very short.
Yeah.
Sorry, I ought to confess here, I cheated. When I knew that Rowan's poet poems are a bit longer than mine. I chose 3. Sorry about that. and I sent them to Wynn, and he didn't say anything. He was too polite to say anything, so I let it pass. To one kneeling down, no word came, only the wind song, saddening the lips of the grave saints, rigid in glass, or the dry whisper of unseen wings, bats not angels, in the high roof. Was he balked by silence? He kneeled long, and saw love in a dark crown of thorns blazing, and a winter tree golden with fruit of a man's body. So God seems to be absent. There is no word. You can imagine a country church in winter, very cold, not much comfort. But the word does come in Jesus. He kneeled long. So the Logos theology, the whole business about the word being made flesh, and saw love in a dark crown of thorns blazing. So that's the crucifixion. And a winter tree golden with the fruit of a man's body. Gold, the colour of divinity, and full of fruit. So there's a kind of allusion there to resurrection. But of course you've got to...
Which he didn't believe in.
Well, I would say he did.
Well, he said he didn't.
Well, I'm not sure. Did he say that?
Yeah.
Did he say that? Right?
Yeah.
Don't think so quite.
No, I think he did. I don't think he said that either. He talked about... what he actually said was, look, resurrection is an interpretation. And of course it is, because nobody actually saw Jesus raised from the dead.
Yeah.
And if nobody saw Jesus raised from the dead, that is an interpretation of how things are. And what he then said was that people claimed that they had seen him. And therefore, you have to base your belief on that. Oh. And I think that's quite in line with...
Yeah, I think I'd read it very slightly differently in that when he says resurrection is a metaphor, to speak about what it might be for Jesus not to be dead, we scramble around for words. Resurrection, of course, it's a resonant theological term for us. Yeah. It simply means standing up again in Greek. Anastasis. You stand up again. And that's a metaphor. Now, I don't think that forecloses the question
of whether it's true or not.
Of what it is to claim that it's true. I mean, to say, as I put it rather crudely, Jesus is not dead, which is a fairly crude and literal way of putting it. Now, what word do you find for that? Similarly with incarnation, enfleshing, the fleshizing of God. It's a metaphor. It's not just a metaphor. We use metaphors because we can't find any more truthful or accurate ways of talking. So I don't hear him as just doing a kind of standard liberal Christian, it's a substitute for something else stuff.
And why does he talk about love's risen body? You know, that's and this Christmas shows us how love bleeds. You know, there are poems like that there. Right. So that if you take bits out and if you take him out of context, I mean, I think John Barney actually, is he here? No. Has an article in Planet where he says that it would be much better if R.S. Thomas had been an atheist and just declared himself to be an atheist. Much better.
He wouldn't have written a thing.
Well, exactly. and that's the whole thing. That's the whole point. I mean, I think he's missed the point totally. That this man is full of faith. Okay, he struggles with it, but which one of us doesn't struggle with it daily? And, you know, the Bible struggles with it. And I think, in fact, he's a source of encouragement rather than discouragement, because you think, when you read some of this poetry, you think, well, yeah, I couldn't put it quite like this, but that's a question I've been asking too. Yeah. You know?
one more thing about that particular poem is, I think it's a question to anybody who says that R.S. is not a musical writer, because that is an extraordinarily musically elegant composition. Lots of monosyllables, but also soft monosyllables and soft consonants. It's unusual in that respect, as if he's conscious orchestrated, as if he's conscious of saying something a bit more kind of deliberate and focused than he might ordinarily say about this. It's got that polish to it, and I don't think that means it's artificial.
And why did he say, if he didn't believe in God, that he didn't think that anything worthwhile came easily, and that the quest for a relationship with God was the most important quest that anybody could wish to make, and that's why his poetry, when he went to Aberdaron, became more metaphysical and concerned with his relationship with God. Because that's a fundamental question.
Yeah, and just to round this off before then, I'd quite like to hear R.S. himself read a poem, which he does with the next one you're going to come to. But I remember having this sort of chat with him. It was actually in a pub. There was another story. Towards the end of his life, and what had happened was we'd gone to another pub where there was jukebox music, and no sooner we'd gone in and R.S. said, "This will never do," and we stormed out again. And we found a quiet pub, and we set to talking. And at one point I asked him, frankly, do you believe in God? And he looked at me and he said, the question for me is not whether there is a God. The question for me is what sort of God.
Yeah, exactly.
And that seemed to me to be a very, very striking remark. All his poetry is about what sort of God, really,
absolutely.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, having said that, then let Andy, if we're still with you there, can we just hear R.S. reading in church, which people also get in front of them? It'd be nice to hear his voice and his almost liturgical way of reading his poetry.
Isha. Often I try to analyze the quality of its silences. Is this where God hides from my searching? I have stopped to listen after the few people have gone, to the air recomposing itself for vigil. It has waited like this since the stones grouped themselves about it. These are the hard ribs of a body that our prayers have failed to animate. Shadows advance from their corners to take possession of places the light held for an hour. The bats resume their business. The uneasiness of the pews ceases. There is no other sound in the darkness but the sound of a man breathing, testing his faith on emptiness, nailing his questions one by one to an untenanted cross.
Do you follow that?
Well, it's back again to the double theme, isn't it? It's back again to this unknowability of God, this absence of God, this inability that we all have to describe God as he is in himself. And that's in line with Christian mystical tradition, John of the Cross.
Yes.
All the great mystical writers will say to you, and we're able to say what God is not rather than what God is. And then that totally ambiguous phrase, as we said, nailing his questions, one by one to an untenanted cross, Does that mean it's all in vain? There's nothing there, so why bother? And that's a terrible symbol. Or is he not there because he is risen? And therefore, that's a symbol of resurrection. And that's where you find the answers.
I would, I think, underline there possibly the word nailing. there are two things going on in the actual poetic movement, I think. One is very simply, I suppose, trust the silence. There's nowhere else to go. And yes, nothing in centuries of prayer has animated these stones in the sense of imbuing them with an unambiguous, visible life, but where else is there to be? And the second wing of it is nailing the questions, which I hear as tacking down with the words you can find what it means to trust the silence, as if you're sort of drawing pins around the edge of the space. It's a very finely balanced poem in that sense, which again gives full rein to the negative, the questioning, ends with that enormously teasing phrase, and yet nailing the questions. I mean, the questions, of course, not being just mine, but the ones I hear. And I wonder if I could go to my other one briefly.
This is Two Views.
Two Views of Olympus,
Yeah.
which is longish, 2 pages. Time to read it?
Of course, I think so, yeah.
Two Views of Olympus. Modern technology of late took us sufficiently quickly up Olympus as to surprise God at his absence. The water was not holy, but merely the mineral H2O. In summer, a god is shorn of his locks to be bound invisibly with tourism's chains. So clear the air we lay, peering over its edge, with nobody on the bottom. Like Prometheus, we returned jubilant with the omniscience we had appropriated from an effete god to the hotel at his foot, where a child had been born to the proprietors, and born simple. Above us, in the afterglow of our relish, the mountain began putting on size, imponderable as unscalable, towering as that other had towered above Wordsworth, so that we gazed into it as into the cave at Delphi, from which there would issue answers leading to questions, to answers, to more questions in the infinite regress. Went to Greece. Olympus deserted, or so I imagined it from the silence. But in case the god was in hiding up one of the gorges, impenetrable as his shadow, I said, lifting my prisms to the eagle-vacated sky, there is a past here rivaling our own past. What message can I return with from this depopulated temple to my own equally depopulated country? Does a god indicate his displeasure by refusing so much as to eavesdrop our prayers? Is the emptiness of our culture a reflection of the emptiness of our religion? Then suddenly above me, like a fleck on the mind, a raptor appeared, traversing my lenses. Yes, on your way, I murmured, to your gnawing at Prometheus's liver, as back home the envy of a carrion-loving people worries at the probity and the reputation of the truth-teller who would do them good. Now, there's a huge amount going on in those two poems, and I think, two halves of the poem, Two Views of Olympus, and I think they illustrate both the strengths and the weaknesses of R.S. as a poet. The strength I find mostly, to be honest, in the first half. Here is apparently, at first, a fairly, I would say straightforward, but at least intelligible picture. We arrived at Olympus hoping for some sort of epiphany, some sort of spiritual experience. It didn't happen. And back to the hotel at the foot of the mountain, where a child had been born, you think, just for a minute, that sounds a bit Christmassy, to the proprietors and born simple. And you still have, I think, a Christmas echo there.
Yes, you do.
The folly of the incarnation, as it were. And then you have that wonderful the cave at Delphi, from which there issue answers leading to questions, to answers, to more questions. And that's where I connect with the in church one, because the questions are not just what we put, but there's a sort of questioning back and forth. And then the second, I feel, starts interestingly, and then the last few lines you think, oh dear, that sounds uncomfortably like RS and automatic pilot.
Yes, yes.
We could have done without that. If that is that the message coming back from the hauntedness of Olympus? And I don't know, I may be doing him an injustice there, but to me that somehow drops into
I agree.
something like banality.
Because his is a high-risk poetry, isn't it?
Exactly.
And when it fails,
When it
it's
fails, yes, yes.
And there are poems that can suddenly switch from one
Yes,
to the other.
yes, yes.
And there are some miracles where the tension is sustained, you know.
That's right. And somewhere you think it's going to be average, and then suddenly it blazes out in the last line or so, and you think, oh, that was worth waiting for.
Yeah, yeah. I've said before, it reminds me of, I recently learnt that what the Native Americans were most afraid of when they fought the whites was not so much their guns as rain, because the rain meant that their own bowstrings went slack, and they couldn't fire the arrows anymore with the usual venom. And sometimes I think it rains on RS's poetry, and that's when really it begins to fail. But nevertheless, there's one question I want to ask, and then we're moving towards the end, but I'd like us to hear him reading Sea Watching, and then just a word or two from you about his poetry, his contemplative poetry. But those last lines of the first part, Rowan, where he says that into the cave at Delphi, from which there would issue answers, leading to questions, to answers, to more questions in the infinite regress. Now, that for me helps me understand why RS wrote incessantly about, so to speak, the same subject for the last 30, 40 years. If I one anecdote, and then you can talk to it. But before the publication of his last volume, Views of the Furies, I was in Grigornog with RS, so I got to know him very well, and I knew he'd like to be teased, so I said, I gather you've got a new volume coming out, RS. Yes, he said, yes. Best part about it, he said, is the title. I said, very good, new Views of the Furies. And I said, tell me, RS, it's not about God, is it? And he said, yes, he said, yes. What else is there to write about? Well, he certainly didn't write about much else for the last 30 years of his life. Now, there are critics who say that is his weakness. That is, he gets stuck in a rut, etc. My line is different, but what's yours?
My line's different too, I think. There are poets who are absolutely haunted by certain questions and themes and images and almost metaphorical pictures. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that Shakespeare, from 1600 onwards, writes about fathers and daughters and fathers and daughters and fathers and daughters. He can't let go of it. He has a go in King Lear at this staggering reconciliation scene with Lear and Cordelia. And then it's as if he stands back and says, I still haven't got it.
I've nailed it. Yeah.
And then, nailed it, yes. And then when somebody comes along and says, would you write a few scenes for this Pericles thing we're doing? And the awful rubbish of a lot of Pericles is presented to Shakespeare, and he writes the dialogue, the Pericles and Marina, which is, to my mind, as great as the Lear dialogue. And then you have The Winter's Tale, and and in its way, Cymbeline and The Tempest, he can't let go of it. Now, the last thing I would want to say about late Shakespeare is that he's lost it. He cannot stop himself, even at the risk, and it is a big risk, of, if you like, sacrificing other aspects of his art so that he can go on and on thinking this one through, imagining this one through. Now, I think there's something of that in later RS. There's an element of sacrificing certain things. He can't let go of this one, and he's got to go back to it because it's this infinite regress. Infinite regress is a strange term to use, but the unceasing echo within the cave, I think, and he's just listening and listening for every note of that echo.
Yeah. Barry?
Well, yeah, and I suppose what he's really saying is, well, I've got to come back to it because I can't nail him down. He is unfathomable. I can't let him go. He can't let me go either.
Yeah.
And some of the poetry, like I suppose all poets, some you can take to and you can really think, this is wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
And some you think, well, I can't make head or tail of this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what he's really saying. And perhaps he was having an off day, but who am I to say that? You know, because there are some, for lots of poets really, you think, gosh, this seems very banal and very ordinary, and what's he really saying at all? It's seemingly meaningless. And then suddenly, you know, there's fantastic stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
The computer can't find God. No code, no number, no address. Yeah. I think, gosh,
he's
just
done
like
it
that,
again.
you know?
Yeah, and this otherwise just a comment, not a question, because I want us to go to sea watching. But there is a wonderful phrase he uses in the late poem, which seems to be sum up so much of the poetry of the last period, where he talks about the cry of a whale, cry of a whale as pain searching for an echo, which I think is an astonishing phrase. And I think of the late poetry as being pain searching for an echo, I must say. And that's why it keeps recurring. He can't get rid of that pain. However, Andy, can we just share this wonderful poem, Sea Watching, and then just a few words about that, and we will round up.
Sea watching, grey waters, vast as an area of prayer that run endless. Daily, over a period of years, I have let the eye rest on. Was I waiting for something? Nothing but that continuous waving that is without meaning, the curve. Ah, but a rare bird is rare. It is when one is not looking, at times one is not there, that it comes. You must wear your eyes out, as others their needs. I became the hermit of the rock, habited with the wind and the mist. There were days, so beautiful the emptiness it might have filled, its absence was as its presence, not to be told anymore, so single my mind after its long fast, my watching from praying.
Well, it's a pity in a way that we don't have that text in front of us, because the way that he reads it doesn't make it clear that there's a line break at some very crucial points, as always in the poetry. Ah, but a rare bird is rare. It's extraordinary, because the redundancy of that repetition of rare, just when you expect a different word to come in, you know, is striking, and seems to be at the very heart of the poem. But what I wanted to talk a bit about as we end is this, I think, is an example of what I would say poetry is meditation. Not only about meditation, but I think the poetry itself is a meditation.
That's right.
Would you agree with that?
I would, yes. And it seems to me that that poem is a very good instance of, if you like, enlarging the little phrase I used a while ago, trust the silence.
Yeah.
And
Don't you think the blank pages are important in R.S.'s poetry?
Absolutely,
I mean, the poems seem to rise out as if they're rising from the silence that blank page represents.
Yes, there's all sorts of very interesting critical discussion of the margin and the text.
Yeah.
And R.S. uses big margins.
He does.
In every sense.
He does. Yeah.
So yes, I think it is a meditative exercise, and the waving without meaning.
Yeah. With a pun on waving.
Yes, not waving but drowning. You've got to hear that, haven't you, in the background of that line. And then, well, of course it's rare. Of course, you don't just pick up the meaning. Of course, this is bloody hard work. You wear your eyes out as some of their knees, looking and looking and looking, and who knows?
Yeah.
Just once in a while. You see, well, what? What have you seen? You can't say. And I think the way in which that particular poem leads you through, in a very verbally skillful way, the sort of soft, repetitious, looking out at the sea kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And then well, I guess, of course, don't expect to see anything. Because it's only when you're not expecting that you see. It's only when you're not there that it happens. And it's a bit like that, issuing in nothing thing in the Raptor poem.
So, yeah.
Nothingness in the sense of your being absent, in some sense, your projects, your ego, your busyness being absent. Well, maybe when you're absent, God stops being absent.
Or if, again, to pick up a pun, because it's full of puns, of course,
yes,
as always, as poetry is, it goes back to the ambivalences that are built into the texture of poetry. I mean, sea watching, it's sea in the other sense as well, isn't it? That is a poem which shows you how seeing can become watching, you know?
Yes.
So it is constantly that playing with language going on from the very beginning.
Right.
Barry?
Well, it's about this encounter with God and what it actually means. And in other poems, he says, I would have knelt long wrestling with you, wearing you down. Hear my prayer, Lord, hear my prayer. Yeah. And he says something, it appears this is not what prayer is about. Yeah. It is about a relationship. It is about waiting. It is about patience. The meaning is in the waiting, in his poem on kneeling. Yeah. You've got to spend time at it. He says somewhere, I can't remember where now, where he says, well, the trouble is we expect quick answers, quick fixes. Well, it's not going to happen. Anything that is worthwhile has got to be worked at. And the relationship with God takes a lifetime and beyond, and it really has got to be worked at. And I compare that poem, Sea Watching, with that other fantastic poem, I think, the other, where he talks about, again, the ocean, and he's listening to the swell born somewhere in the Atlantic, rising and falling, rising and falling. And the thought comes of that other being who is awake too, letting our prayers break on him, not like this for a few hours, but for days, years, for eternity.
Yes.
And if God is that patient, why shouldn't we be?
Yeah. Well, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi'ch dau. We are greatly indebted to you for sharing with us the fruits of your own contemplation, I think, of R.S.'s poetry. So, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.
I nearly took your spectacle case. Thank you. Thank you for making it.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Rhowch chi nhw hwnna i fi gofio yn noson, oce? A Barry, newch yn ymwneud. I gael bwyd, mi eisiau bwyd. Oedd hwnna'n arfer.